Hello, and welcome to the Gallimaufry, a podcast about history. I'm Will, and joining me remotely is my co-host Nick. How are you doing today, Nick?
Hello there. Yes, I'm doing absolutely fantastic. How about yourself?
We're moving house, so I'm surrounded by packing boxes. It's like a little cardboard fortress. It's quite nice, really.
And it sounds like you could use some help carrying all that stuff. So it's quite apt considering the topic we're going to be looking at this week.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent.
If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world.
Today, we're going to be talking about the Berlin Airlift, or the Berlin blockade, which was an event that happened on June the 24th in 1948. It was really the first major contention point during the Cold War.
1948, this is just following the end of World War II. The Allies had defeated Germany, and Germany itself was now being occupied by the Allied forces. So we had Germany split into the four zones of occupation. The Soviets, the French, the Americans, and the British.
Cleaning up the aftermath of Nazism was fraught with difficulties because you had so many different factions emerging. As you said, you had the British, you had the French, you had the Americans, and of course the Soviets, who had swept their way through Eastern Europe and reached Berlin first. This wasn't great news for the people of Germany because the Nazis committed lots of terrible war crimes, but the Soviet revenge against the German people for the crimes that were enacted against them was equally horrific. You had, mass looting, murders, rapes.
So there was a lot of bad blood on both sides. So Germany ends up divided into these four zones of occupation. And then the question becomes what to do with these four zones.
So there was a feeling on both sides initially that Germany was to be punished. One of the key things that every side wanted, doesn't matter whether you're Russian, American, British, was that they wanted Germany deindustrialized, demilitarized, where they couldn't do any damage to anyone.
Countries like France had now, during World War One and World War Two, been invaded by Germany, and you can understand that they'd be very keen for this not to happen again. The Soviets were similar in that they wanted a weakened Germany that would no longer be a threat to them. They also attempted to implement Marxist policies across Germany as well, and this kind of ran up against the ideas of the other Western allies. As well as Germany itself being split into these four zones, the capital Berlin was also split into four zones. This would be fine if Berlin was in the middle of the country, but it was actually 100 miles into the Soviet zone, and this complicated things slightly.
And anyone who's been to Berlin will probably be familiar with the idea of Checkpoint Charlie, which was the point between East and West Berlin. If you do go there, it's a lot of fun, but don't get your passport stamped, as technically that will invalidate it, which I found out. So yeah, Berlin was a sort of microcosm of the macrocosm of Germany. The Second World War hadn't even ended by the time problems started to develop with this idea of occupation. On June the 29th, 1945, Deputy of the US Army, General Lucius Clay, I mean, what a name that is, he was left in charge by Eisenhower. He led a delegation of allies to Berlin to discuss access routes, but the Soviets were incredibly wary. They agreed to one highway, a railway line, and 3 air corridors, thinking it was going to be a temporary thing. Of course, this led to a lot of problems because basically the Soviets controlled all the ground movement, and it means they could delay and they could stifle the Allies whenever they wanted. In fact, it took the Allies about 3 weeks to set up a base in Berlin, where they, on arrival, discovered that the Soviets had dismantled everything. A governing body was set up on July the 11th, 1945, despite this, called the Inter-Allied Kommandatur, and it was basically responsible for administering the city. And this was the kind of the start of something the US Secretary of State, a guy called Burns, really wanted, was the idea of this 4-way power share, which was in reality never going to happen.
And it is around now that the Berlin votes for its mayor, and it votes for a man called Ernst Reuter. The Soviets, however, don't like Reuter, and they actually block his accession to the mayor.
There was this guy called Walter Ulbricht. He was in charge of basically making sure the Soviets maintained a sort of foothold, and he didn't like the idea of free elections. So what he tried to do is he tried to merge the Social Democratic Party, which was the sort of champion of Western ideals and democracy, with the Communist Party. But unfortunately, when it came to the vote, he lost it by quite a margin. In fact, this was actually the first election held in Germany, a free and fair election since 1932, and the final tally was 29,610 against, 2,937 for. Overall, the elections were an absolute disaster for the city council as well. They only won 26 of 130 seats.
So this is really telling of the opinions of the people of Berlin at the time. This wasn't just a normal election. This was one that the Soviets really, really wanted to go their way. So they took part in sort of mass propaganda. Posters were put up. Soviet soldiers would actually threaten citizens on the street. It's kind of amazing that despite all of this, it was such a sort of a washout against the Soviet interests.
About this time, all the Allies were trying to decide what they're going to do with Germany. They can't sit in it indefinitely. They wanted them to pay reparations. They wanted them not to have any military, but they also didn't want to stay there forever indefinitely. Communications with the Soviets to sort of figure out the future were not sort of developing in a positive way. But then the worst winter on record in Europe at the time happened. It was the longest period without sun. People were herded into rooms with one small stove. The old literally froze to death, wrapped in rags in beds. Children walked barefoot in the snow. Then on top of that, the following summer, they experienced a massive drought, so crops were basically failing all over the place. This combination of terrible conditions, people suffering heavily, really started to change the attitude towards Germany. But also, in America, there was a growing concern that they didn't really want to be involved in European politics. Truman, on the other hand, who had taken over from Roosevelt after his death, he wanted to ensure that Europe was strong so that, another war would never happen.
I think there was also a view that after the First World War finished and Germany was very much punished for their actions, there was this sort of idea that if you broke Germany, it would no longer be a threat. And that obviously turned out to be completely wrong because World War II happened.
That's interesting because there was a perception on the Allied side that they'd gone easy after the First World War, which is why they had to be a lot harsher the second time around. There was a growing consensus that Germany should be able to take care of itself, should be eased into governing itself. But, Soviet Russia didn't want this. They wanted a centralized government. They wanted reparations to be paid to them continually. They wanted to increase the amount of reparations. They wanted more control of the Ruhr Valley, which was the industrial heart of Germany, produced loads of coal and steel. But the Americans weren't very forthcoming with that. Talks went nowhere about the future of Germany. The Americans decided, in combination with the British, to create the zone of Bisonia. This meant combining the American and British territories into one. And they wanted to make them self-sufficient. This desire to get Germany back on its feet manifested in what would be termed the Truman Doctrine, which I'm sure most people are familiar with. It was the idea that Europe needed to get back on its feet and America would be there guiding it. And
I remember that. It had Jim Carrey in it, didn't it?
And the next part of that plan was finding Sarah Marshall. Oh, wait, no, sorry.
The Finding Sarah Marshall Plan.
Yes, the Finding Sarah Marshall Plan, which was also known as the European Recovery Programme. It was basically a massive programme that was going to provide aid to Western Europe. And it started in 1948 and would go on to provide more than 15 billion. And the brainchild of this was the US Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, who replaced Burns. And it was crafted as a 4-year plan. It would help reconstruct cities, industries, infrastructure, and they wanted to sort of remove the trade barriers between European neighbours. Well, that sounds familiar. Wouldn't that be a good idea? As well as foster commerce.
We don't speak of that.
As well as foster commerce between countries and the US. And stop the commies. They didn't phrase it like that in the plan.
So for the Americans, it was all a bit of a win-win, really. Show up the communists and also lend a lot of money to the Europeans, which they can then use to buy goods from the Americans.
True. To be fair, there were 3 main beneficiaries of this plan, and it was France, Britain, and Germany. But even though they were going to get 15 billion, this amounted to only 2.5% of their combined national income. So it wasn't actually that much to go on, but it was a huge psychological boost and a huge statement of intent. Russia started to get a bit agitated. They began to hold up traffic, subject trains and people to searches within Germany that were travelling to Berlin. Routes started to be closed without warning due to, in brackets, repairs.
Berlin at this time was not a great place to be. Half of it was under Soviet control, and all the little joys that come with that, which Nick has just gone into. To be a Berliner was to struggle. There was limited food, there was limited shelter. A lot of the buildings were damaged, so they couldn't be lived in. A lot of Berliners took to living together underground in basements, as those were some of the few surviving structures. And to top it all off, their currency, the Reichsmark, was suffering from massive inflation. I think it got to the point where in certain areas a loaf of bread would cost, a whole paycheck. When Germany was occupied, the occupying allies began printing money again. The Western allies allowed the Soviets to also print money, sort of a political move. The Soviets, however, went a little bit mad and started printing excessive amounts of notes to pay for the rising costs of the occupation. And this just further and further devalued the Reichsmark. The most common kind of currency, I guess you could call it, was American cigarettes. So attempts were made to reform the situation. However, the Soviets kept holding up negotiations because they wanted a fixed higher figure on reparations from Germany. In the end, Basonia planned its own currency, and the Soviets in turn planned their own as well.
So the introduction of the currency is quite key. It was introduced on June the 19th across the Allied-controlled zones. It wasn't introduced to Berlin just yet. And this is where it becomes a crunch point that leads to the blockade. So you have a bunch of other things going on as well. You have obviously Soviet fears that the Western Allies were sort of preparing to sort of enact this federal constitution in Germany that they didn't want. And the currency was kind of the last kick in the teeth, because they basically said to the Western Allies, you cannot introduce this into Berlin. The Allies ignored this, and it was introduced to Berlin on June the 23rd.
Yeah, and interestingly, when they shipped the Deutschmark over from America, so that it wouldn't arouse suspicion with the Soviets, they were shipped in boxes which were labelled doorknobs.
The currency itself actually caused a bit of irritation in Germany because of what was put on it. So some notes had images of buxom girls carrying tropical fruit. Another one had males wearing loincloths, standing in front of ships that Germany were no longer allowed to own.
I'm not sure either of those images are ones that I associate with post-war Germany.
It was certainly odd. Anyway, when it was introduced to Berlin on June the 23rd, the very next day, the blockade began. Although officially the Soviets never acknowledged it was a blockade until a lot later. They just claimed there were technical difficulties.
And obviously, when there's technical difficulties, the correct approach would be to encircle the capital of an occupied country with your own troops. And that's what the Soviets did, obviously. The Soviets, reasonable as they were, they did offer to fix all the difficulties if the Western Allies withdrew the newly introduced Deutschmark from West Berlin.
The Allies in Berlin were literally cut off from the rest of the world, effectively. By closing the, albeit limited routes, they had no way of supplying the city.
After this sort of sudden downturn, Truman is presented with three options by his cabinet members. He could withdraw, which would show weakness against the Soviets and could encourage further expansion. They could remain until the situation becomes untenable and just allow the population to starve before finally booting out the Allies and joining the Soviets out of desperation. Or they could open the roads by force, which would almost definitely lead to direct conflict with the Soviet Union and possibly another war. And at this point that Truman says this famous line, "We stay in Berlin, period."
However, this is where we go back to those 3 air corridors we introduced earlier. It was the only thing they couldn't close down because you can't close down the sky. The obvious solution was to ship in supplies, but the problem was they didn't really have the planes to carry enough, supplies to do this. But nonetheless, it was the only option available. It was an RAF officer called Rex Waite who suggested that they could reenact something that had already done before called the Little Lift. It was basically an operation where they shipped in a bunch of army rations to people following the end of the war to alleviate some of the supply issues. And basically he formulated a plan to increase this on a massive scale. It only took 2 days for this system to begin. On June the 26th, the first C-47 Skytrain arrived at Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. By the end of that day, 25 flights had been made, bringing in 80 tons of milk, flour, and medicine. In order for everyone in Berlin to have an adequate level of living, they needed about 4,600 tons of supplies every day. Because basically the planes they had carried about 3 tons. Throughout the year, they would improve upon this up to about 10 tons. But the biggest problem was obviously they had to power Berlin, and coal was quite heavy. And shipping in coal proved to be one of the most challenging things.
So it was going to be a tough job. That was pretty apparent from the start. They were nowhere near their quota, but they were instructed that they were going to make it work. The Americans brought in planes from their US air bases from across the world. By the 28th of June, British aircraft were joining the fleet, both state-owned and private airlines, as well as planes from France and Canada, and then air crews from Australia and New Zealand and South Africa.
British bases were actually closer to Berlin, so they had a base in Fassberg. It used to be an old Luftwaffe fighter station, so they had to convert it and build new runways. And they had to do this within Berlin as well. Because there was a supply shortage in Berlin, people inside were literally scraping, rocks from craters, laying makeshift tarmac runways. It was a real community effort inside Berlin and also outside to get this network of planes up and running. So the Americans would land in Tempelhof, which was a problem in itself because Tempelhof was located in the city. In fact, in order to accommodate these large planes bringing supplies, they had to remove a church spire, to which, somewhat hypocritically, the communists decried as sacrilegious.
Yes.
And then the British would fly into Gatow. Such was the effort. You had crews sort of in these air bases working round the clock. They were working at least 12-hour days. They were sleeping on billiard tables or whatever they could find in these sort of old airports. And the rations they survived on were these things called naffy buns, which were not particularly pleasant. And there was a joke that went around the British crews that if you threw one at someone, you could kill them.
One of the things that I thought was quite nice to take away from this was the reaction from the actual citizens of Western allies, like Britain and France, donated things to the airlift. They donated food and supplies to try and help the people of Berlin.
I think that's exactly right. And you had the same thing from British soldiers. So there's one guy who was a pilot, a dispatch rider even, called John Huggins. And he would often share his rations with some of the sort of children that would come to help clean up around the bases and the airports. It got to the point where he would get collections from the other pilots of the chocolate they would get as a ration and give them to the kids.
There was actually an American pilot called Gail Halverson. He would form little sort of parcels out of handkerchiefs with parachutes, and he would fill them with sweets, and he would drop them out the plane as he was landing. He was doing this entirely off his own back. Nobody had told him to do it. But he came to be known as the Candy Bomber. And eventually, General William Tunner caught wind of this. He realised what was going on. And rather than reprimand him, he actually saw it as an opportunity to raise morale. And he instructed the other pilots to begin dropping these sweets as well for the children.
We haven't actually said what the operation was called, so everything has a name in military speak. So the operation to feed Berlin was called Operation Vittles. And this additional one of providing treats was called Operation Little Vittles. It's kind of sweet. And it's interesting you mentioned General William Tunner. So he didn't actually start overseeing the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift was overseen by a guy called General Smith, who was also overseen by General Curtis LeMay. By July the 2nd, there were already a fleet of 52 C-54s, 100 C-47s carrying 1,000 tons every round trip they made into Berlin, which was incredible. The Russians were still maintaining there was no blockade. But on July 3rd, this facade fell away. They basically said Berlin would never be open until the Allies gave up the establishment of an independent West Germany and removed their currency. It was, at this point, a waiting game. The Soviets were just hoping that eventually the Americans and the British would run out of steam. But enter William Tunner. He was an interesting character. He was very much a sort of Henry Ford type who believed in streamlining processes, making everything almost conveyor belt-like.
This wasn't Tunner's first rodeo. He'd actually commanded another airlift into occupied China over the Himalayas during the war, so he was pretty well qualified for this role.
Tunner introduced a bunch of ways to improve the efficiency of things. He reduced the number of hours so that they were more manageable and less draining on morale. Loading and unloading routines were streamlined. Crews were told to stay close to their planes before they would go off and get snacks. Instead, he brought mobile snack bars to them. After watching one plane crash after doing a sort of fly around with them, which was a day called Black Friday, not to be confused with the many other Black Fridays in history, but also the more modern interpretation, which is, getting a cheaper computer off Amazon or whatever. On this day, he saw a bunch of planes crash after their landings kind of screwed up in bad weather. Because what was happening with the stack system that General Smith introduced of planes sort of flying in formation at different speeds, at different heights, sort of staggered, was that they ended up waiting around the airports to land and wasting a lot of fuel and becoming a bit of a danger because the corridor was getting a bit built up. So he sort of made it more streamlined, more smoother in the way they approached. If a plane couldn't land properly, it had to turn around and go back and try again. By August, you had them hitting their target of 4,500 tons a day because of the measures he introduced.
Yeah, and while all this is going on, the Soviets are doing what they can to sabotage the effort, short of direct conflict. So they're shining searchlights to blind the pilots at night, and they're buzzing the planes with Soviet fighter planes. I
love that. What are we going to do? Shine light in their eyes. Shine in their eyes.
It's really... It's how I torment my cat.
It's really childish. Yeah, it's really childish.
It is really childish. But it must be... when some of these pilots, the ones who were actually delivering these supplies, they were doing long, late shifts. They were tired. It was stressful. And they have all this going on. So when Tunner made his changes, they must be a real godsend to these pilots that there was this kind of order to it.
As you mentioned, the Soviets were doing all they could to disrupt, to harry, but they also were trying to disrupt the democratic process, which was still going on. So you still had elections and the assembly meeting every month, but they even attempted a coup on September the 6th by shipping in a bunch of drunk protesters to storm the meeting.
Where have we heard that one before?
Couldn't possibly comment. In response to this, over 200,000 Berliners protested in a rally a few days later. Unfortunately, it ended with the death of a 15-year-old boy who was shot and a lot more injured in the protest. But it served to reinforce to the West, Germany was still there. They were still going to fight against this Soviet repression.
So they're finally meeting their quota of 4,000. But then the winter comes, and with that comes the fog and the cold. And suddenly landing these planes becomes a lot more difficult. Visibility is a lot worse. And it's a particularly cold winter, so the demand for fuel goes right up. Berlin, they've already used up their firewood, they've chopped down their trees, and yet still the airlift keeps pushing on.
Electricity was rationed during this time. Most families could hope for one hot meal a day. Citizens found ways to survive. In fact, there were lots of efforts to generate electricity. So there's one story of a man who got his wife to pedal a bicycle to generate his drill so he could help build stuff. Whatever people could do, they tried. And somehow they came through it. By February 1949, the airlift was delivering a daily average of 5,500 tons. And by the 18th of that month, the millionth ton had landed at Gatow. And all the while, the Americans are trying to table UN resolutions to get the blockade to stop, but Stalin keeps vetoing them all.
You might say Joseph was Stalin.
I should put you in a Stalag for that.
Oh, no. You had to ruin it.
Despite all the problems that developed during the winter, December the 5th saw more elections, which only further compounded the Soviets' unpopularity. Tunner has a good idea to improve morale. He organizes something called the Easter Sunday Airlift, which was aimed to break all records of how much they could supply in a day. This required maximum efficiency, so it was, they simplified the cargo, and it would only be coal that would be airlifted. But from noon 15th of April to noon 16th of April 1949, crews worked around the clock and delivered 12,941 tons in 1,383 flights without one single accident, which meant a plane landed every 63 seconds.
So the Soviet Union, who were quite confident going into this that the West would back down, now have a bit of an issue. The airlift has arguably been more of a success than they really anticipated. They thought this would be over quite quickly, that they would abandon Berlin and basically Joseph Stalin would get his way. And it's just been a complete embarrassment for them. In private, the Soviet generals are considering their options.
From around April, you have this change of mood from Russians. No longer they're using inflammatory language as they used to. And in fact, the way Stalin answered questions from journalists was that they would write into him and he would write back if he felt, compelled to do so. And one journalist asked about the possibility of ending the blockade, and he wrote a letter which was actually quite positive, saying the currency was no longer an issue. And this was further outlined when the Soviet news outlets started reporting that the blockade could end soon.
So following this announcement by the Soviet news agency, there was a willingness to end the blockade. Negotiations begin among the four occupying powers. And then on the 4th of May 1949, they agree that the blockade will end on the 12th of May that year.
Unfortunately, this didn't mean the end for the pilots, because they had to keep going until the end of September. In fact, September the 30th was the very last flight. Although they were delivering supplies, these were just enough for people to get by. So they needed to build up a surplus again. The reasons for why the Soviets eventually decided to effectively back down, people have said they were getting a lot of negative PR, effectively, from the rest of the world for not giving in. But really, I think one of the main cruxes was that one thing we didn't mention was that as soon as the blockade was imposed, albeit unofficially for technical reasons, I'm going to start using that in daily life now when I don't want to do anything. The Allies enacted an embargo for the entirety of Eastern Europe, basically. So along that line which divided Germany, goods stopped flowing into Soviet-controlled territories, which was a major blow to all of their industries. So you could argue that ultimately it did come down to money.
On the subject of money, the total estimated cost of the airlift was $224 million. In today's 2021 money, that's $2.5 billion. In total, over 2.5 million tons were lifted into Berlin throughout the whole ordeal.
This whole episode showed that the US were committed to peace in Europe. The US were committed to rebuilding Germany. It showed that Berliners and Germans were committed to opposing communism.
And then the day after the blockade ended, the federal constitution was signed. And then by May, Bizonia had joined with the French zone to become Trizonia. And then that eventually led to the formation of West Germany on the 23rd of May.
What we'd like to remember about this story is that it was a huge effort by people on the ground and people afar to save the lives of people that might have starved to death and preserve as much of their freedom as they could. That was another epic journey that we've obviously missed out of quite a lot, but hopefully that was the key points. But Will, did you have any particularly interesting facts you stumbled upon?
It's actually a really interesting point in at least post-war history, as we sort of at the very beginning of the Cold War, which would come to sort of really overwhelm the rest of the century. But one thing I thought was quite interesting, Ernst Reuter, he was eventually in another election, he was re-elected as mayor of Berlin in 1948. And in this election, he won with the highest percentage of any free election in German history. He won 64.5% of the vote. And so far, that has never been bested. What's your interesting fact, Nick?
Mine doesn't directly relate to the airlift. It relates to the sort of build-up. So as we mentioned, there was a huge desire to punish Germany and to make sure the Germans knew their guilt. On the American side, they introduced a rule called the non-fraternization rule, which effectively meant you couldn't so much as talk or socially engage with anyone. You were there to do a job to make sure peace was maintained. So obviously a lot of soldiers broke this fraternization rule, which led to the implementation of a $65 fine. Thus, propositioning a girl became known as the $65 question. It didn't deter a lot, though, because in the Anglo-American zones, there is estimated up to 70,000 post-war babies were born to unmarried mothers.
That's a lot, yeah. So this is the part of the episode where we discuss myths that we found concerning this episode's topic. One of the myths that we came up with was that while it is referred to as the Berlin blockade, Berlin was never fully blockaded at any point during this time.
Within the actual city, it was very difficult to actually blockade different sections because you had power stations fueling bits on the east and power stations fueling bits on the west. So there was a bit of free flow movement within the actual city. And in fact, some historians have suggested that it was actually harder to be a sort of Soviet supporter within the city because the overwhelming majority of Berliners were actually in favor of the West and were very much wanting to be part of the West.
So that's our show. I hope you found it interesting. I think I certainly did. But now, what are we going to talk about in our next episode? Hopefully it's not going to be a stinker.
The next episode, we're going to be talking about the Great Stink, which is still not as foul as that joke you just told, which was an event in London in the 1850s where basically the whole city did not have a pleasant aroma.
Yes, there was a period in time when London smelt worse than the basement of the carpet shop after one of our long recording sessions. So yes, please join us next time for another hodgepodge delve into history. If you'd like to get in touch, you can also email us at info@thegallimaufry.show. But with that, I think we're done here, are we? Are we done?
On that note, smell you later.